Hello people and welcome back to another video. In this session, we'll be going over the concept of two-sample t-test. Now, in some of our previous sessions, we had discussed t-test in great detail. So in this particular session, we'll be taking that concept and we'll be using that concept for more than one sample. So in this session, I'll be giving you the general idea of the two-sample t-test. And in our next session, we'll be going over some problems on two-sample t-test. So the general idea here is that instead of one population, I have two populations now. So let us go over the parameters first. So in case of one sample, I used to represent my population parameter or the unknown population parameter as mu. This would represent the mean of the population. And this was the unknown parameter. Now here, in this particular case, we have two unknown population parameters, mu1 and mu2, corresponding to the two samples, sample 1, corresponding to the two populations, population 1 and population 2. We used to represent x bar as the mean of the sample that is taken from the population. That was represented using x bar. Now, as you would have rightly predicted, here we have not one but two samples. So we'll have two sample means, x1 bar and x2 bar. Alrighty. Now, in our previous example, we had something called as an S, which was the sample standard deviation. Here also we'll have two sample standard deviations, S1 and S2, and represented the number of observations in a sample. And since here we have two samples, they will be represented by N1 and N2. So these are some of the common notations that we'll be using throughout our discussion on two-sample t-test. Now, what is the purpose of two-sample t-test? What do I need to measure, or what is the condition against which I need to find out evidence? In short, what is my null hypothesis? So in a two-sample t-test, your null hypothesis or H0, we are trying to find the difference in the population means of both the populations. And our initial condition that we need to go from is there exists no difference between the two populations, which means my null hypothesis will be mu1 minus mu2 is equal to 0. This is the null hypothesis that we need to start with when we are doing any problem on a two-sample t-test. The difference between the means of both these populations is 0. The alternative hypothesis can depend again on how we justify or how we propound the alternate hypothesis based on our given condition and based on what exactly do we need to find evidence for. Do we need to find evidence that the mean of the first population is greater than the second population, or that the mean of the second population is greater than that of the first population, or we need to find evidence on for both of these scenarios. On the basis of that, we'll conclude whether our alternative hypothesis is one-sided or two-sided. And if it's one-sided, which one is it? Is it towards the right or is it towards the left? Now, all of these concepts have been covered when we discussed t-test, z-test previously, but we'll cover this aspect once more when we'll be discussing problems on two-sample t-test. We'll not be discussing the concepts explicitly in extreme detail, but if you know the content of the previous videos or the previous sessions, you will see all of the previous concepts fleshing out when we'll be discussing problems on two sample t-test. So there are a couple of conditions which are important before we carry out a two sample t-test. Now these conditions are the condition of independence, the condition of same measurement, and the conditions of normal distribution. The conditions of independence means that the two samples that have been chosen, they should be chosen independently. Same measurement, it means that we have to compare the parameters of both population which have similar measurement units. And finally, the condition for normal distribution means that the unknown parameters in both the populations should follow either a normal distribution or something very similar to that of a normal distribution, which means t distribution is also allowed. Henceforth, we are studying two sample t-test. As I mentioned, we are interested in estimating that there is no difference between the means of the two populations. That is our null hypothesis. That is exactly from where we need to begin. We need to begin from mu1 minus mu2 is equal to 0. Now let us come to the test statistic and the degree of freedom for a two sample t-test. Now, very simple, degree of freedom, which is very important when we are solving problems on t-test, because that is something that we put every time we calculate probability or we calculate a critical t-value. Degree of freedom is always a parameter that is very important when we are basically calculating probability using pt or a critical t-value using qt. So here degree of freedom is going to be minimum of n1 minus 1 comma n2 minus 1. So n1 is the number of observations in the first sample, n2 is the number of observations in the second sample. In the previous scenario, when we only had one sample t-test, the degree of freedom would have been n minus 1. Here, we'll just take n1 minus 1, n2 minus 1, and the minimum of that will be considered as the final degree of freedom. Now, for the test statistic, t-value is given by x1 bar minus x2 bar divided by square root of s1 square divided by n1 plus s2 square divided by n2. This is the value of my test statistic for a two sample t-test. Right. So this is the general theoretical knowledge that you must have and all that you need for a two sample t-test if you have to go ahead and solve any problems on two sample t-tests. In the next session, we'll be looking at some problems on two sample t-test. But as you might have seen, we have moved from z-test to t-test and now two sample t-test. The key concepts of critical value, test statistic, and five-step procedure. These are going to be sacrosanct in all the further sessions coming up from here on and in some of our previous sessions as well, especially when we are doing any kind of a test. So if you are still not clear with those concepts, I would highly urge you to brush up all those concepts. Like I've said always in the previous sessions, but it's my responsibility to tell you once again the same thing. Now, in the next session, we'll be going over some problems on two sample t-test. I'll see all of you all in the next session. Thank you.